All right, so I'm going to start on part two here, bills and laws. Um, going to talk about how a bill becomes a law. Um, to start with, this is the process within the Congress. The bill first gets introduced by a member of Congress. Bills can be introduced in either the House or the Senate, but remember that revenue bills, bills related to taxation, have to be introduced in the House of Representatives first. As soon as they're introduced in the House of Representatives, the Senate can start working on its own version. Uh, for any other bill, they may start in either house. They may start in both houses at the same time. They, but they have to be introduced. That's the first thing. Once they're introduced within each house of within each chamber, they get referred to the appropriate committees. So in the House of Representatives, they would get referred to a House committee that reviews the bill, starts looking at the evidence, calls witnesses, uh, determines if maybe the bill needs, some rewriting, some polishing up. Same thing happens in the Senate. If one's introduced in the Senate, it gets referred to a Senate committee, and the Senate committee starts working on it. If it passes the committee, the next step actually may be that it needs to go to another committee because there may be multiple committees that have jurisdiction over it. And it also typically has to go to something called a rules committee, uh, to determine what happens next. But once it gets through the committee process, it goes for floor action. That is, it goes to the floor of the House of Representatives or Senate, where it can be debated by the members. And when they decide it's time to end debate, they vote on it. They decide, and they also may vote on amendments. People may bring, members may bring amendments while it's on the floor. So if it's been through committee, the committee may have amended it. Now it's on the floor. Individual members may propose amendments. If they propose an amendment, it doesn't just automatically go on there. There has to be a vote on the amendment. So this is where a lot of times uh, things get, um, misrepresented a little bit. People will vote a particular way on an amendment, and it will be taken as meaning that they voted for the bill, or it will be represented as they voted for, uh, something that they didn't. Sometimes Congress people dislike a bill so much that they will present an amendment that makes the bill to where it won't pass. And so the people who dislike the bill will get together and vote for an amendment, even though they don't like the amendment either, because they know it's going to kill the bill. And so that's also where sometimes you might see something like, Ted Cruz voting for some wild policy that he stole from Bernie Sanders, because not because not because he believes in it, but because he knows it's going to kill this bill that he doesn't like. Uh, After it's voted on in each house, because they each go through their own process and they each have their opportunities to add amendments and they've gone through their own committees, even if the bills that get introduced started out looking exactly alike. So a senator and a House member may have gotten together, written bills that were identical and introduced them, but they've gone through this process and they may have been changed. So now you have a Senate version and a House version that both passed, but they have differences. And so at that point, the thing that happens is they'll form what's called a conference committee, and the conference committee has members from the Senate and members from the House. So it's a joint committee between both, and it looks at the bill and says, what can we hammer out to make this work? Um, Whatever the conference committee approves then has to go back to each house and get voted on. And usually they reach an agreement that the conference committee version will be a yes or no vote. It doesn't have to be, though. The members of each house still have their same privileges they always do. Uh, but a lot of times in advance, they'll agree they're going to go with the conference committee for an up or down vote. If it's an up vote in both houses, goes off to the president to be signed or vetoed. Um, and that's what this video here is about. I'm not going to play you a video in a video. It's it's a 1975 children's education video. It's got singing, it's sappy, um, but it actually puts the whole process in perspective in a really good way. I don't really think that we add a whole lot to this video in all the talking that we do, except that sometimes we slow it down a little bit and maybe make it, you can think a little more about it. But I highly recommend watching this. It's kind of silly, but I highly recommend watching it. So let's see. Yeah, so types of bills, types of laws, congressional rules and operation, committees, leadership. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead with types of bills and types of laws. So types of bills, there are several kinds. Public bills, private bills, joint resolutions, concurrent resolutions, and simple resolutions. Public bills are just what they sound like. These are the things that actually make laws that apply to everybody. Tax laws, healthcare reform, national defense authorizations. We're going to pass that law to make it so that guy can't grow the plant in his backyard. All of these things, these things that apply to everybody, that are general purpose, um, and they're passed under the normal procedures. Those are called public bills. There's a thing called a private bill. These deal with individual matters like immigration cases or claims against the government. So they affect specific individuals or organizations and they don't apply to anybody else. I'll give you an example. Growing up, I had the lady that lived next door to us who had two very small American citizen children. She was a Filipina. She was a widow. Her husband had been in the U.S. military and had met her when he was stationed in the Philippines. They came back. She had a valid fiance visa, but they got married 2 or 3 days after the visa expired. And as a result, when she went to apply for citizenship, she thought she was going to become a citizen. And she wanted to apply for citizenship. She wanted to get her passport so she could visit family in the Philippines and come back. She found out she was actually not legal because they got married 3 days too late. Had he still been alive, she still could have applied for a spousal visa um, and gotten her citizenship, and it would have been a relatively simple matter. But because he was dead, she wasn't his spouse anymore. And so the law didn't provide for this. Um, and Congress wasn't going to revise the whole immigration law to, to deal with her, but friendly members of Congress did put up a private bill. And to give you an idea of how a private bill has to work, for this private bill to happen, to allow her to become a citizen, it had to pass unanimously in both the House and the Senate and be signed by the president. So there couldn't be any objection in the House or the Senate, and there wasn't, so she was able to become a citizen. I mean, it was a pretty much no-brainer case um, that, here was the mother of two American citizens who, uh, even under the new Donald Trump interpretation of citizenship, they still would have been citizens. They were the children of a U.S. citizen, U.S. military member, and they were born in the United States. Um, it was pretty much a no-brainer that this should happen. And fortunately, no members of Congress, because immigration wasn't as controversial an issue at the time, so the members of Congress let it happen, and that's an example of a private bill. Joint resolutions. So these are basically the same as bills, and if they pass, they have the force of law. But there are four specific measures, like declaring war or proposing constitutional amendments. So they're not, joint resolutions are not for creating general law of the type that public bills are. So you wouldn't use a joint resolution to pass a new criminal law. You're going to use a joint resolution. And the process for the joint resolutions is a little different because, as the name implies, they're not introduced in each house, the whole committee thing, etc. Um, they're going to go through a little different process. Um, and then concurrent resolutions are not really they're not really to make laws. And so the president doesn't have to sign them. So they're just used to express an opinion. So they can be used for budgetary purposes. So the Congress will pass a concurrent resolution saying this is what we're going to do in the budget, but it's not the actual budget. It becomes a blueprint for passing the actual budget. And so that way the members can refer back and say, when they propose something in the budget, they can say, well, this is how it fits into the concurrent resolution that we all agreed on. They're also used to adjourn the Congress, to put the Congress into recess, um, when they want to go home. Uh, another example um, would be another example of a concurrent resolution, and a reason that they would not require the president's signature is if they want to censure the president. If they want to say the president has done something wrong, we're not going to impeach him for it. We don't think he should be removed from office for it, but the House and the Senate agree he should not have done this. Bam, that's going to be a concurrent resolution. And obviously, the president wouldn't sign that, but he doesn't have the opportunity to, because it doesn't carry the force of law. It's expressing the opinion, but it's an important opinion. It's the opinion of a majority of both houses of Congress. Types of laws. There are three types of laws, and this is important in understanding what bills are all about. So there's statutory law, constitutional law, and common law. And the part that applies most to the bills is statutory law. Statutory law are the laws that are passed by Congress and end up codified in the United States Code. They're going to cover all kinds of issues, from current criminal justice to environmental protection, and these laws are the public bills. So when they pass a public bill, it becomes a statutory law. Private bill doesn't become a law, it only affects a specific organization or individual, and so it's, doesn't become a statutory law. The joint resolutions may affect constitutional law because they're for things like proposing constitutional amendments. But generally, the Congress does not pass constitutional law. Constitutional law is the Constitution and the interpretations of it. But Congress can influence it by passing a proposed amendment. Um, the Constitution itself is the supreme law of the land, and so all the interpretations of it that are valid are also the supreme law of the land. Uh, it's important. It's the thing that the government runs on. So I covered that in the last class, why it's important. It's generally interpreted by the judiciary, and the Supreme Court makes final decisions. If all of the lower courts agree on something, the Supreme Court usually won't even step in. It's only on cases where the lower courts don't agree. So you have courts in Texas saying, in the U.S. courts from Texas saying one thing, and the U.S. courts located in California saying another thing. And then it gets to the appellate level, and the two different appeals courts disagree. That's where the Supreme Court will step in. So then common law comes from the courts. It's not passed by Congress, and it doesn't come from the Constitution directly. Um, the thing is, so this is judge-made law. It's not made by Congress, but it's actually not made by U.S. judges. This is judge-made law from England. It's the English common law as of 1791. Why that date? That's just the date that was decided on. But it is referenced in the Constitution, specifically in Amendment 7. So the U.S. courts recognize the English common law up to 1791, and then since 1791, the constitutional law governs. There's some interpretation of common law past that point, but it's all under the Constitution. So The judge-made law in the U.S. has to adhere to the Constitution. Congressional rules and operations. So I'm going to talk briefly about the types of committees, their roles, and how the committee system works. I already gave an overview of this, so this is more just overview. Um, Types of committees. So standing committees are committees that are always there. They work on specific policy areas. So these are things like agriculture, finance, foreign affairs. I'll talk about some of the important standing committees in a minute. Select committees are made for appointing or appointed for a specific purpose. So we find out that there's a major issue with some environmental policy. And it's such a unique major issue that we don't just want to have the environmental committee look at it. We want to create a broader selection of Congress to look at this specific issue because it's complicated. So we want them to really dive in and not have to worry about the other issues. So they're going to get together, investigate it, put some stuff together. And at that point, they may turn it over to the committee that has the jurisdiction, like an environmental affairs committee. But they're going to do a little bit deeper in the Chat GPT language. They're going to do a deep dive into it in a way that the standing committees can't. Joint committees. Um, these are committees that have members from both houses. So these are going to be areas of common concern like taxation or the economy. These are also going to be your conference committees. So what do committees do? Committees draft bills that can become laws. Like this is one of the big ones. I went through it in the whole process that, bill gets introduced and then it goes to all these committees before it ever gets to the floor. And then once it gets to the floor, it ends up having to go to a conference committee most of the time. And then it comes back for another vote. So that's one big thing committees do. Another thing committees do is conduct oversight, and this, especially those standing committees, regularly bring in the heads of executive branch agencies and people that work for executive branch agencies and ask them what's going on in your agency. They'll grill them. They ask them a bunch of questions. Ted Cruz gets his face on television asking questions. Um, John Cornyn gets his face on television asking these people questions in these committee hearings. Um, Barbara Boxer used to get her face on television asking these questions. Chuck Schumer gets his face on TV asking questions. Um, it's big opportunity for senators and congresspeople to get their faces on TV. But it's part of the process, actually. It's their job to conduct oversight and make sure that the executive branch is doing things to actually comply with the laws. Um, they hold hearings. So some of the hearings are like the oversight hearings, but they also may have hearings to gather information in order to draft new legislation. They may hold hearings on some big issue, and the hearings may just be to decide is legislation necessary before they even start drafting it. And then if they decide it's necessary, then they start talking about, well, what are we going to do about it? And they go back to drafting legislation. They may also hold hearings after they've drafted legislation. They may bring in appropriate experts, members of the general public, um, people associated with affected organizations to see what their input is before actually voting on the legislation. So what's the importance? One really important thing is expertise. So 435 members of Congress, the government regulates all kinds of different things, from banks to farms, from the military to the Peace Corps, from the foreign aid to temporary aid for needy families. Um, expecting each of those 435 members of Congress to be an absolute whiz kid expert on all of those things, especially when some of the 435 members of Congress aren't a whiz kid expert on anything, um, is asking too much. But if they spend, typically, members of Congress, once they get on a committee, they get reappointed every Congress. If they get reelected, they're going to go back to the committee. Now, if the parties change hands, then they may be a minority member of the committee when they were a majority member before, but they're still going to stay on the committee usually. And so they get time to develop expertise over the full time they're in Congress. And this is one of the arguably one of the arguments. Well, it is definitely one of the arguments that people use against term limits. Is it a valid argument? Well, there are arguments on both sides. That's a decision you have to make, for yourself, which weighs the most. But this is one of the good arguments against term limits, is that they develop some expertise. There are good arguments for term limits too. Um, Efficiency. They divide the workload, um, because, again, there are all kinds of issues. Expecting all 435 members to spend the amount of time that the committee spends. So the committee will spend a lot of time on an issue, hold a lot of hearings. You can't expect all 435 members of Congress to do that because there are lots and lots of committees. There aren't enough hours in the day. Um, and then I mentioned with regard to the hearings that they'll bring in people from all kinds of affected areas, including just general members of the public. And so it gives an opportunity through that hearing process, for members of the public to get involved. It also, not just through the hearing process, but members of the public can do all the normal things they would do to contact their own congressman and contact the committee members instead, so they could contact the appropriate people handling a policy. Um, Conference committees. So I already mentioned these. I'm not going to go through them in great detail. This is when there's a difference between the bills from the House and the Senate. House members and Senate members both get appointed. Their job is to come up with a compromise both houses can approve. Um, and the exact rules for each conference committee are set by the House and Senate in resolutions that they pass, or in agreements that they make. So when they make these conference committees, it's approved by both houses that they're going to have a conference committee, and the rules for the conference committee are set up, and they go and they do their thing. Some major committees. So big ones that you're going to hear about a lot. The House Ways and Means Committee, arguably the most powerful committee in Congress, because it does tax policy, trade, and Social Security. It's the money committee. If you are worried about your taxes, this is the committee that does it. If you're worried about your Social Security, this is the one that does it. Probably the second most powerful, maybe tied with House Ways and Means, is the Rules Committee. The reason being, they determine the rules for debate, they determine the amendment of bills on the House floor, they set the rules for the entire Congress, but they also are the ones that rule changes and rule exceptions have to go through. The House Judiciary Committee is also pretty powerful because they oversee the federal court system. Any impeachment of federal judges is going to come from here. They don't have any power in the appointment of federal judges because that's all given to the Senate. But they do have oversight power, and any impeachments of federal judges, which do happen usually for bribery, have to start in the House, and they start in this committee. House Appropriations Committee is responsible for the spending half of the money. So Ways and Means is responsible for the taxing half. Appropriations is responsible for the spending half. The House Intelligence Committee, oversees the CIA, the NSA, all of those alphabet agencies that are out there spying. are all overseen by the House Intelligence Committee. It's a very important committee because those agencies have a lot of power. The Senate, on the Senate side, the Senate Finance Committee, similar to House Ways and Means, it has jurisdiction over tax policy and trade. The Foreign Relations Committee does just what it sounds like, um, oversees U.S. foreign policy, so it has oversight responsibility for the State Department. But it also is responsible for confirming ambassadors and other high level diplomatic appointments. The president has to run them through the Senate, and the first place they go is the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a vote, for hearings and a vote before they ever get to the floor for all 100 senators to vote on. The Senate Judiciary Committee, same thing. They do the oversight of the federal court system. Um, they're also, though, their biggest power is when the president appoints a new federal judge for a life term. Um, the first thing that happens is the Senate Judiciary Committee investigates that person, holds hearings on that person, um, and and the appointment can actually be voted down by the Judiciary Committee. So a judicial appointment from the president can get voted down by this committee before it ever goes to the full Senate. Um, if it gets voted up by this committee, then it goes to the full Senate for consideration. Um, so I will talk about leadership in the next part. I'm going to stop here and I will post the other as well. Bye.